Welcome to the History of Learning Games podcast. Together, we'll explore how digital games have shaped the ways we learn, have led to some of the game industry's most fascinating successes and failures, and the lessons they have for us about teaching and learning. Let's play. Back in episode 1, I mentioned that complex board games have been used as learning games to train strategic thinking going back to ancient times. Chess is a good example of a game like this, though its origins are more recent. Chess is a staggeringly rich and complex game, as attested to by the body of thought that's developed around it over the centuries. And we know that chess, with its narrative of laying siege to capture the king, was used throughout its history as a military training tool. Despite their complexity and deep strategic elements, chess and games like it lack many characteristics of real military engagements. For one thing, in a chess game, both players have access to the same information about the game at all times. They know where all the pieces are on the board, whose turn it is, and so on. Game designers call that information the game state, by the way, and while the players of a chess match are entitled to perfect knowledge of it at all times, the same isn't true of actual war. The expression "the fog of war" refers to this phenomenon. Commanders often have to make decisions in the absence of information, like having to decide whether or not to attack without having perfect chess-like knowledge of your opponent's position or strength. Similarly, in chess, the complete rule set is known to both players. Things like how the different pieces move, what it means to be in check, and so on. This also isn't true of real war. Your opponent can do things that break the rules or at least defy your expectations. Around the turn of the 19th century, a Prussian-born baron named George Leopold von Reichwitz, who was, among other things, what we would today call a board game geek, noticed differences like these and decided to design a military combat game that realistically represented the warfare of the time. Think Napoleonic warfare or the American Civil War to some extent if you know your military history. The work of this noble miniature wargamer and later his son would come to define the wargaming genre, and the innovations they developed have become essential parts of many digital and non-digital game genres enjoyed by tens of millions of players today. It's also possible that the work of these martially minded learning game designers indirectly contributed to the formation of a unified German state, and, rather more darkly, some of the worst chapters in 20th century history, because the Reichwitzes created what Marshall Neal, the founder of the international society dedicated to the game, calls the great-grandfather of war games. In fact, its name literally translates as wargame, the game of Kriegsspiel. This is the second of 2 episodes focused on non-digital learning games. Before we get to the main narrative of digital learning games, that's the real focus of the podcast. As I mentioned in episode 2, where I talked about snakes and ladders, I wanted to start with these 2 examples, and they really are 2 examples among many I could have chosen from, because they're fascinating in their own right, but also because, in my experience, starting any discussion of games and game design with non-digital games makes the key concepts easier to grasp than starting with digital games. Plus, in the case of Kriegsspiel, we're going to see some of the design challenges and Kriegsspiel solutions to them more than once in the digital learning games to come. And frankly, this is just a great story. Let's get back to it. Baron Reichwitz starts wrestling with the things he sees as deficiencies in the design of the early or first generation tabletop wargames of his time, which eventually leads him to construct a prototype aimed at creating a more authentic wargame. Reichwitz's prototype included a number of innovations compared to games like chess or existing wargames. Instead of using a 2-dimensional grid like most earlier and later board games, Reichwitz's game featured realistic, sculpted 3D terrain, first in the form of wet sand, and then using modular tiles that could be rearranged to create different battlefields, the latter development coming after he got himself invited to present the game to King Frederick Wilhelm III of Prussia, and decided that wet sand wasn't regal enough for His Majesty. And instead of moving pieces around the spaces of a game board, Reichwitz's pieces represented military units that could move freely about the terrain in the way the units they represented did on a real battlefield. Reichwitz's game was a hit with the royal family, but it was expensive to produce and never caught on. The fact that its ideal audience, military officers and trainees, were busy fighting in the aforementioned and very real Napoleonic Wars probably had something to do with it. If the Horatio Hornblower novels are to be believed, they all preferred a friendly game of whist between engagements anyway. At any rate, Reichwitz lost interest around the time old Boney got what was coming to him at Waterloo, and further development of the game stalled until the 1820s, when Reichwitz's son, with the equally fantastically martial name of Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reichwitz, picked up where his dad left off, working with a small circle of other junior officers in the Prussian army. As a game maker, I have to say, I love this story because what Reichwitz Jr. and his co-developers do in the 1820s has so many parallels with game development 200 years later. I like to imagine Reichwitz and his buddies sitting around the barracks, eating pizza and chugging energy drinks as they have impassioned arguments about this or that minor design point. But in all seriousness, what Reichwitz and his buddies engage in is what we would today call an iterative design process. They're trying and testing new ideas, seeing what works, getting rid of what doesn't, and doing it over and over again, all in pursuit of the goal of making the game's representation of combat as realistic as possible. They're creating an incredibly rich simulation game, and coming up with one brilliant idea after another, a fair number of which we still use and take for granted in games today. The result is Kriegsspiel. In previous strategy games, including earlier war games, game pieces represented combatants or whole units, as in Reichwitz Sr.'s prototype. But in earlier games, a game piece's victory or defeat was an all-or-nothing proposition. If your piece is taken in chess, it goes off the board completely. Kriegsspiel introduced the idea that in-game units could be partially defeated but stay on the field, in the way real military units take casualties. It became possible for a unit to survive multiple rounds of enemy attack, taking damage each round, before ultimately being overwhelmed and taken off the map. In other words, Reichwitz Jr. and his colleagues invented hit points. Like the prototype, units in Kriegsspiel move about the game board freely. However, instead of using 3D terrain, Kriegsspiel uses real, detailed topographical maps, traditionally at a 1 to 8,000 scale. This made it possible to simulate any historical or anticipated future battlefield. Now, okay, the idea of using a real map seems clever, but also a little obvious. You might ask, well, why didn't earlier wargame designers like Reichwitz Sr. use them? This is another answer I absolutely love because it again has direct parallels with modern game development. The answer is that topographical maps with the necessary detail and scale didn't become widely available until the 1820s. So Reichwitz Jr. and his buddies were taking advantage of and probably geeking out at least a little over the cutting-edge technology of the day, just like modern game devs do when new hardware and software technologies become available. But Kriegsspiel's most significant contribution to game design comes in its solution to the problem of simulating the fog of war. Remember, the fog of war concept was absent from earlier war and strategy games. Players tended to have a shared and perfect knowledge of the game state, which in no way resembles real combat. Reichwitz Jr. solved this by introducing, and let's make use of some of the games as a system terminology we brought up in episode 2, and call it what it is, a new component, the umpire. In Kriegsspiel, 2 players control the opposing forces. You can, and people frequently do, play with more than one player on a side to represent the levels in the command structure of the army, like each having an overall commander, then division commanders who report to him, brigade commanders who report to them, and so forth. But we'll stick with talking about just 2 opposing players to keep it simple. Instead of taking turns moving their units around a shared game board, each player submits his orders for each turn in secret to the umpire. And these are authentic military-sounding orders like dig in on this hill, or attack the enemy's right with this brigade and attempt to turn his flank. not abstract game moves like queen to king's rook 5. The umpire collects the orders from both players and then interprets them based on a combination of the game's formal rules and his, the umpire's, real-world military knowledge. Early Kriegsspiel umpires were military officers with extensive experience who knew how things tended to go. If opposing units came into contact, the umpire would roll a set of specialized dice and apply the game's rules to the result to determine the outcome of the engagement. The umpire pulls all of this together over the course of a turn and then updates the game state. One of the most powerful things about the games as a system way of thinking is that it helps you appreciate the interconnectedness of a game's elements. The addition of the umpire component enabled or required changes to other elements of Kriegsspiel, all of which wound up contributing to making the game's military simulation more realistic and more useful as a training tool. Instead of Kriegsspiel space being a shared game board, the addition of the umpire enabled the space to be reconfigured, which was key to solving the fog of war problem. Kriegsspiel space is made up of not one, but 3 copies of the game map, or potentially more if multiple players are on each side. The umpire's map contains a perfect picture of the entire game state, where every one of both players' units is and what each unit's strength is. But each player's map reflects only the state of his own units, plus those of his opponents that he's come in contact with. The rest of the game state is hidden from him. It's a bit like the position players find themselves in Battleship. You know the number and types of your opponent's ship, but only get a sense of where they are when you score a hit. The result is that in Kriegsspiel, as in real war, a commander makes decisions using only the knowledge that he has, not from the omniscient and artificial perspective of the umpire. The addition of the umpire also allowed for simulating other realistic war challenges. Remember, Kriegsspiel is a simulation of 19th century warfare, and in the 19th century, nothing on the battlefield beyond visual range moved faster than the fastest horse. Well, nothing other than a bullet. And that includes orders and information. To simulate the challenge this posed, one of the umpire's jobs is to simulate the speed information moves at. The game includes rules for this so that, for example, an order a commander gives from his simulated position on one side of the map might sit with the umpire for several turns before he carries it out with the unit it has to do with on the other side of the map. By that time, the state of the game may have changed in a way that makes it more or less likely that the order will succeed or even be relevant. It's even possible for an order to be given and never carried out by the umpire because in real war, sometimes messengers get shot, in spite of us all being told not to do that. Similarly, as in real warfare, orders themselves can sometimes be unclear or based on false information and assumptions. One of the umpire's jobs is to interpret the player's orders, but he's not supposed to interpret them in the most advantageous light for the player who gave them, nor from his perspective of omniscience. He's supposed to interpret them fairly, but in a way that would be reasonable for the receiving unit to interpret them on the real battlefield, and that includes in ways that are different than the commander meant. And since he's human, it's also possible for the umpire himself to make mistakes, either in implementing orders or even in applying the game's rules. And while Kriegsspiel allows for do-overs in limited cases, the general rule is that players play through the umpire's mistakes. That's kind of the game's way of representing the whims of the gods of war. Suffice it to say that the addition of the umpire component and the changes it brought to other game elements was a major unlock that allowed the game to fully realize its potential as a realistic and useful training tool. It's so useful a component that it's evolved and survived to the present day. It's a feature of many modern war games, both tabletop war games and the kind of war games that military organizations conduct out in the field with real equipment and personnel. And it's the progenitor of the game master concept that's commonly found in tabletop role-playing games like the Dungeon Master in Dungeons & Dragons, who, in addition to serving a rules enforcement and interpretation role, also frames and leads the players in advancing the game's narrative. To wrap up the story of Kriegsspiel's development, by 1824, Reichwitz Jr. and his team have a working version of the game and present it to the king and his generals, who immediately recognize its potential as a training tool, ordering a copy for every regiment in the Prussian army. Doesn't catch on with the military right away, though, and Reichwitz falls out of favor with the military establishment for unrelated reasons. He gets himself exiled from Berlin to a remote post, where, sadly, he commits suicide in 1827. But the game survives outside the military in private German wargaming clubs, and the rules undergo a series of updates by enthusiasts in the 1840s and 50s. By the 1860s, the revised game is finally used widely as a training tool throughout the Prussian military. The period following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 is one of relative peace in Europe, and you get several generations of soldiers and military leaders across the continent who lack significant combat and, in particular, large-scale field command experience. That includes the Prussians, but they've been playing Kriegsspiel. When Prussia finally does go to war in the latter half of the century, first against Austria in 1866, and then against France in 1870, it absolutely dominates its opponents, defeating Austria in a month, and defeating France in 6 months, the latter resulting in the capture of Paris. There are many factors that led to Prussia's victory, but on a purely military level, it prevailed both times over evenly matched or maybe even slightly superior foes in certain respects. It would be ridiculous to attribute the Prussian victories solely to Kriegsspiel. But Prussia's is the only military in the world with a wargaming tradition, and some contemporary commentators see a connection. This is what Matthew Caffrey, a modern scholar of wargaming at the Naval College in Newport, Rhode Island, has to say about this in his 2019 book. Quote, Prussian forces were more often than not outnumbered. Weapon advantages were mixed, and training methods were similar. At this time, though, the Prussian military had a monopoly on second-generation wargaming and had integrated it into its staff education and its staff planning methods, especially at the higher levels. Unquote. In the wake of these Prussian victories, other countries start to take notice, and by the 1880s, most of the world's major militaries are using wargames, and Kriegsspiel in particular, for training and planning purposes. I'm not a historian of wargaming or otherwise, but if you buy that Kriegsspiel played a role in those Prussian victories, it's probably worth taking a moment to connect a few political and historical dots, because there's an ominous side to all of this. The Prussian conflicts with Austria and France are collectively known as the Wars of German Unification. For all its history up to this point, what we now know as Germany was a collection of independent states of which Prussia was one. Prussia's victory over Austria led to its dominance over the other northern German states, and its victory over France led to Prussia becoming the dominant force in unifying all the German-speaking states, with the exception of Austria and Switzerland, into the modern state of Germany under the Emperor or Kaiser Wilhelm I. Prussia rode to victory and into the leading position in the new German state on a wave of militaristic nationalism, which was bolstered by its victories and became a feature of early German national identity as a whole. This nationalism continued to grow during Wilhelm's reign and ultimately contributed to World War I and Germany's role in it under his grandson, Wilhelm II. Germany's subsequent defeat in World War I and its aftermath led directly to the rise of another form of political and economic nationalism, National Socialism or Nazism, and ultimately World War II. So, rather darkly, you can indirectly connect an extremely well-designed educational game with the 20th century's most destructive conflicts. That's a bit of a downer. So, to end the story of Kriegsspiel on a positive note, the game has been continuously played in military contexts and by regular old enthusiasts ever since. It's enjoyed an uptick in popularity in recent years, both through in-person groups and in particular online play. The aforementioned International Kriegsspiel Society constantly hosts games online on its Discord server because it turns out that sequestering individual players in their own chat threads is an effective way of achieving the same thing as having players use their own map tables back in the day. Check them out if you want to learn more about the game or you think you might have made an excellent 19th century general. Today, wargaming is still going strong as an entertainment genre. Miniature wargaming survives as a real-world tabletop game type with a diverse set of games that run the gamut from historical warfare to modern warfare to science fiction and fantasy in their conceits. The Warhammer franchise is probably the most well-known, but there are others, including ones that tie into franchises like Star Wars and Game of Thrones. A significant element of the experience for many tabletop wargamers is decorating the tiny game pieces that represent their units, a task that I entirely lack the artistic ability and fine motor skills for. And if you play digital games in the tactical war games or turn-based strategy genres, or their little brothers like tower defense, things like the XCOM franchise, you're familiar with video games that descend from the same branch of the gaming family tree. In episode 1, I mentioned that one of the ways in which games are a uniquely effective learning tool is that they let players try and fail in a safe environment, in ways that aren't possible in the real world. Kriegsspiel is a perfect example of this, not just in the game's design, but insofar as making a realistic wargame that allowed for precisely that was the guiding principle of that design. You can see the legacy of this in the way we use the phrase wargaming today. Outside of playing literal war games, we use that phrase to capture the idea of playing something out in a realistic, safe, simulated form for the express purpose of trying to figure out what to do in the real world. People and organizations wargame conversations, negotiations, business strategies, political maneuvers, and, of course, literal wars. All that is the legacy of Kriegsspiel. We'll see some of these same ideas at play when we pick up the story of digital learning games where it all began in the next episode with another simulation game. We'll take a look at a game that can claim a number of firsts. First in its genre, first video game created by a female designer, first research-based game, and yes, the first educational video game. 1964's The Sumerian Game. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to check out the Substack at historyoflearning.games, where if you subscribe, you'll get each episode in your inbox along with show notes. Those notes are up for the first 3 episodes, and each one contains some bonus info not covered in the podcast, including images of the games I've discussed. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.